What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Drova, Forsaken Kin. Most easily described as isometric Gothic. But before we dive into all that, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below to a video that covers everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, in the case of Drova, it is important to mention that despite the fact that we're a little over a month from its initial release, I did receive a review copy of this. Unfortunately, I was extremely busy at that time and had to put it off for a little bit, but I knew I wanted to circle back around to it, not least of which because Gothic, the game this takes heavily after, was developed by Piranha Bytes, which just recently shut down, so obviously a studio doing something in that vein, and actually managing to do it well no less, was of note to me. But let's talk a little bit about this game. So, as I mentioned, isometric Gothic, but if you're not familiar with the Gothic series, that might not mean anything to you. So over the course of this review, I will naturally elaborate a bit upon that, but put very simply, it is a beloved Eurojank title that, if you are willing to push past that jank, was a really great experience that could hook you into a world that, didn't like you at first, but with a bit of effort, you could forge your character into a real hero with a power curve that felt really, really earned. Now, Drova, being isometric instead of 3D, has a slightly different perspective, but the core tenets are largely the same. In fact, much of the systems work almost identically. And while on one hand, I would say the developers here really made an attempt to make this more accessible than especially Gothic 1 these days is, it is nonetheless a game that inherits a lot of the issues that came with that title as well. Not least of which the fact that as an indie title, I don't think it ever fully lives up to its potential or ambition, namely in the fact that a lot of choices that are presented to you are more superficial than they might initially seem, like your faction choice and stuff not actually leading to much different content. But with that out of the way, let's actually dig a little deeper here. Starting first, as usual, with the technical state of this one. So from what I understand, when this game initially launched, there were a handful of annoying bugs. Most of that stuff seems to be dealt with already, even just 1 month later. Just a few days ago, from the time of this video, they actually put out a bug-fixing patch that fixed all sorts of stuff. I really didn't experience much in the way of problems at all. Really, all I could find is a couple people in the Steam reviews mentioning that the game does not have ultra-wide support. I don't personally use an ultra-wide monitor, so it rarely comes up. And then, personally, I couldn't fully rebind some of the keys on keyboard and mouse, but as the base setup isn't that bad, it wasn't really a deal-breaker. Otherwise, I didn't really have any issues, and best I can tell, at least a month after the fact, nobody seems to be running into much in the way of problems, so you'll probably be good to go there. So next up, let's talk difficulty. So difficulty for this game comes in two forms. The two difficulties the game has, Explorer and Classic, versus normal or Iron Man save mode. So Explorer is basically the easier version of the game that will be less punishing overall. Classic is going to feel very familiar to you if you actually played any game like Gothic previously or much of any of Piranha Bytes' work, as it is functionally very similar. That is to say, you start incredibly weak, but as you raise your attributes and acquire gear, which is a huge part of progression, you become an absolute monster terrorizing enemies as you go. Now, on the save mode side of things, you have just a regular save mode where you can save manually in multiple slots and back things up, and then you have an iron save mode. This disables manual saves and forces you to live with the consequences of your actions, as you might imagine, but as long as you don't back yourself into any unwinnable corners, you'll probably be alright. Next up, this game does feature a character creation screen. It is mostly about customizing your on-screen sprite, which doesn't really have a huge effect outside of your visuals, and if you're wearing armor and a helmet, you won't even see it anyway. A couple of notable things, however, is that you can pick a keepsake. These are just some starting items you can use for your run, which are helpful, but will eventually get outpaced for sure. And you can also choose to skip the introduction to the game and jump straight into the land of Drova, which we will soon find ourselves in regardless, but basically you can skip the prologue. And I just wanted to call that out because I enjoy games that let you do that. But what is that prologue all about brings us to the story setup and my thoughts on it. So Drova puts us in the role of our created character, of course, in a village that seems to have a rough sort of Viking or Celtic vibe to it, but we witness our clan's warriors bring some special rune back from a raid. The druids of your village make a huge deal out of this, and you later see two of them sneaking out with with that item later that night, and you follow them only to see them conducting a ritual that puts them into contact with the divinities, as they call them. But things quickly don't go to plan. Both of the druids wind up dead, and whatever magic happened here transported you, as the lone survivor, into the land of legends known as Drova. However, Drova, being the land of legends, might have been a slight over-exaggeration, as this place isn't exactly all it was cracked up to be. It's mostly a ruthless, unforgiving wasteland where you're just as likely to wind up dead, as opposed to finding anything miraculous. So your job is to quickly get on your feet, to try to stave off that death, but also to deliver the crystal that was brought with you and given to you by one of the dying druids, who tells you to bring it to the town of, I believe it's Nimiton, might be totally butchering that though, which is one of the things you can do. So the story from there is all about explaining what the world of Drova is, what these divinities are, why the land of Drova itself is surrounded by death fog, what happened here, and in chasing down some of these leads, you might just be able to escape this wasteland, which is going to see you joining one of two factions, taking on some story objectives, of course, involving the land and everything mysterious about it, really, and potentially even unlocking a few secrets which can lead you to the good ending of the game. But while the game initially seems to present you with a lot of choice, a lot of that winds up being a bit superficial. The two factions you can join give you essentially identical missions for the most part, especially as far as the main story goes. So while you do have some choices, regardless of what you do, most everything plays out the same way, with most of these choices simply resulting in cosmetic differences to the area. But nonetheless, the game does have a couple of endings. They're personally not as fleshed out as I would have liked them to have been, but chasing down the good ending and doing the side quest and stuff associated with unlocking it, I did enjoy and thought was pretty cool. So there was that at least. And overall, I thought it was pretty solid. But moving on, let's talk a bit about progression. So, again, if you're familiar with Gothic, you'll almost probably perfectly understand how this works. But the gist of it is we gain experience by killing enemies and completing quests, and doing so will of course level us up. When we level up, we are granted 4 learning points. We need to take these learning points, find a trainer, who can then either increase our attributes based on a cap that they have, or they can teach us abilities or talents that they know. Now, this is going to give us the potential to better utilize various types of weaponry, such as spears, swords, axes, slingshots, bows, etc. Now, there's also a handful of other types of abilities that aren't directly related to weapons, such as crafting, brewing potions, lockpicking, that sort of stuff. So while you start off very weak, through increasing your attributes, giving you access to better and better gear, especially weapons in particular, you get stronger and stronger as you go, until eventually there's really not much in the game you have to be afraid of at all. So while you will be getting kicked every which way when you first arrive in Drova, with pretty much everyone out for your blood it would seem, through some perseverance you can get through that and eventually become a menace yourself. Now, through increasing your attributes with learning points or with items, you increase your prowess. Now, this is important because your base prowess is used for learning abilities. Sometimes that will have a requirement you have to meet with your combined attributes. And you can't use gear to supplement that in particular, but you can use gear to give you the stats required to, say, equip a weapon with a minimum amount of prowess. Then we have the gear itself. You're going to start out with basically nothing, and through hard work and determination, you'll move up to, like just basic clothes, and then later leather armor, and then when you finally join a faction or complete certain quests, you'll get armor that can actually protect you and take a few hits, all the way up to a hidden legendary set of armor. Armor makes a huge difference in the amount of damage you take. It's one of the chief bits of progression, so you definitely need to focus on acquiring it. Now, in addition to that, you can also equip up to 4 bits of jewelry or talismans. These are things that are going to have various effects. Some of them are just basic in the sense that they increase attributes, but others have more interesting effects. Like there is a talisman that is inspired by Bloodborne that you have to follow a bit of a hidden quest to actually acquire that allows you to recover health on hit for a short period after you take damage. And there is honestly a bit of interesting item progression here in terms of the effect effects and things on these talismans that was more fun to mess around with than it might initially appear. But then we have our magic and skills. So in addition to all of our abilities and the weapons we have chosen to use, we can actually learn skills to utilize in combat by building focus and then executing those abilities. This is also how you'll activate magic once you get access to it. After you hit a certain point in the main story, you'll be able to learn intrinsic magic that works the same way as your abilities. You build up focus and then cast it. And before that point, you can also find scrolls and stuff that will do the same thing, but obviously in a more consumable manner. But that's pretty much the gist of progression. So let's talk about the gameplay and world. So the world of Drova is one large open area that we're going to explore and interact with as we go. Now, it is truly open for the most part. There are a few places early on in the game that you won't have access to because you won't have the means to get by them, but by and large, you're really only limited by the ability of your character to get through that area. And if you really go all out, you can access almost just about everywhere right in Act 1 of the game. But as you complete main story objectives, the chapter or the act will advance, and this will actually change things in the world. So as an example, one of the first places you'll come across, the woodcutter's camp, if you complete their objectives, sees you trying to rebuild a bridge in the area that was recently destroyed by an earthquake. And if you do all that, of course, that bridge then gets sorted out in the next act and you can actually use it to quickly traverse the place. And things like that, including where characters are and what they're up to, will change from chapter to chapter. Now, for the most part, you're going to have to explore this area on foot, which means a lot of running back and forth, which I really didn't enjoy that much, as even stuff like Gothic had a basic fast travel system. Now, the developer has dropped a roadmap, and fast travel is one of the things they plan on adding here, supposedly by the end of November, but we'll see. So in the future, if you're watching this, you might actually be able to fast travel, but at the time I played it, you have to do a lot of running back and forth, which could get a little old. But from there, let's actually talk about some of the stuff you're likely to encounter in Drova. So most of the quests are centered around quest hubs, or various settlements you'll find, such as the main faction camps, the Remnant Camp or Nimitan, and in you can find the Woodcutter's Camp, a place called the Pit, which is a silver mine, and here you'll interact with characters who will give you various quests, and many of them have more than one solution. For instance, in the Remnants Camp, you can be offered a job to track down a debtors list, and how you go about acquiring that list is actually pretty robust. You can pay someone to get it for you. You can sneak in and get it yourself, either by, actually sneaking, or you can just go in and beat everybody up at the cost of your reputation in the town, which might cost you some gold later. So there are some quests like that that are more open-ended in nature when you encounter these various quest hubs. Now, beyond that, there are actually several, I would say, much larger quests that typically have achievements attached to them, but there's even some more hidden stuff, like, for instance, that Bloodborne reference that I mentioned earlier. But while you're doing all of that, the world maintains a sense of danger, especially in the early areas, because you could very easily wander in somewhere you should not be and easily get killed, which is likely going to happen pretty often. And slowly, over time, as you build up your strength and start to explore these areas that were once inaccessible to you, is really what lends itself to the great power curve that this game has, which I would say it largely inherits from the games it was inspired by. Beyond that stuff, though, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there is a full-blown crafting system. You can find all sorts of items and things and then put them to good use and turn them into useful items to either sell or use for yourself. There is a very basic stealth system that can see you entering places, say, at night in the day-night cycle in order to steal stuff. You can also learn how to lockpick advanced locks if you have, lockpicks to do it, which can get you into all sorts of little side areas and teach you even more things you could potentially do, all while solving the occasional puzzle or partaking in some exploration. Now, all of that combines to make a really solid gameplay loop that is set against the backdrop of an interesting world to actually explore. So, while I think the sort of brutal nature of this type of thing is inherently not for everybody, it really is a ton of fun. Which brings us to the combat side of things. So, naturally, there's a lot of combat in this game, and for the most part, I would say it's a fairly basic system. I mean, it's all right, but I really don't think it's incredible by any means. If you lean into some of the skills and magic and stuff that you get a hold of and find different ways to combo that into interesting plays, let's say, you can do some decently fun stuff, but for the most part, I would say combat was where this game never really wowed me in any sense of the word, because while you can learn extra combos and stuff by getting the abilities for it, and the magic can be interesting, the system itself is still pretty bare bones. so it winds up just being alright, at least for me. Now, combat is made up of the various different weapon types, the combos and training you have with those weapon types, giving you access to what you can do with it, the skills your character knows and can utilize in combat alongside magic, and how well you can execute all that stuff. So first up, the attack combos. Something that people really liked from the Gothic series was that as you learned more about a weapon, that is to say you trained with it, you could enact combos that would actually change the animation around how your character swings and everything, allowing you to make more than one attack if you timed it properly. And that is also present in this game. And I do enjoy it as a show of just basic character advancement as the character you are playing becomes more knowledgeable with it. But then we have the focus bar. As we attack enemies, we will be building up focus, and then as you take damage, it can also go down. But focus is what we need to activate our skills and abilities. So you can't just spam those things, you do have to build up the focus to actually use them, which can be helped along by various potions and things like that that can quickly build up focus for you, allowing you to utilize your spells and abilities more often if that's the route you want to go down. But all along the way, you're going to, of course, have to mitigate incoming damage to the best of your ability, which basically comes down to either dodging or blocking if you have a shield. Now, if you've raised up your dexterity and you're using light instead of heavy armor, you'll have a better time in terms of actually dodging out of the way of attacks, but even in heavy armor, I really didn't notice this being too bad. And it's also possible to just block, of course, provided you have a shield. But once you understand how that works and how each of those things fits together, combat really shouldn't be too bad. Now, you can utilize consumables and stuff in combat to, of course, heal, build focus, like I mentioned, but there's also other stuff like bombs and traps you can set if you want to get the battlefield prepped before you actually even step into battle. And then the other mechanic I wanted to mention was the food bar, so to speak. So you can eat a bunch of food that heals you over time. And outside of regular healing items, what this essentially does is activates health regeneration when you are at anything below maximum health. So this can be used in combat, but each food item like this will grant you a set amount of this, like 60 or 180 being the most common, and every tick of that down to 0 will heal your character a little bit from damage you take. And in combination with healing items can be a solid way to keep your health up in combat. So you have some options. That power curve is really solid, but overall I wouldn't say combat is incredible or anything. Which brings me to the Steam Deck section of this one. So this game officially has an unknown rating for the Steam Deck, but it's pretty flawless as far as I can tell. Controller support, cloud saves of course, and obviously this type of game plays pretty well on a handheld like that. I really didn't have any issues with it at all. So while I'm not sure if they will ever submit for a proper Steam Deck rating, I'd be surprised if it didn't get verified, with maybe the only thing of note being that sometimes the text can be a little small, but that would really be about it. Which brings me to my positives and negatives. So the positives of this for me are the power curve of the game, really capturing that loop of, being just a struggling nobody at the beginning to becoming an overpowered monstrosity by the end of it. Having truly conquered the world that you found yourself in is really just a great bit of RPG progression. And you combine that with a world that is genuinely interesting to explore, with a lot of secrets and stuff that are fun to find and learn for yourself. Like, for instance, there's another way to acquire some learning points outside of just leveling up, or running down the side quest that is necessary to get the good ending, as an example. Really gives you some great stuff to do while experiencing that great power curve. But on the negative side of things, for me, I would say it's two things really. The choices are very superficial for the most part. They mostly lead to the same outcome no matter what, which I would say is definitely where the game reminds you that it is a smaller indie title, and the combat really isn't anything to write home about. Which brings me to my conclusion. Drova Forsaken Kin for $25 US, and whatever that amounts to regionally for you, is, for all intents and purposes, basically just isometric Gothic. And for the people who enjoy that type of game, I think that's great. It is honestly a little more accessible than the Gothic titles, which I think will do a great job of introducing this type of game to a new audience who might not be familiar with those games. But a few minor quibbles aside, for $25, I honestly think this is a great value, in large part because I think it captures the magic of what made the series it was inspired by so great to begin with. And as a result of that, I'm very curious to see what the developers here, a company called Just2D, does from here, and basically what their next project is, because this is a pretty impressive title, and given that Piranha Bytes is now defunct, I'd be curious to see if they move to further expand upon this system and see if they can keep dropping compelling RPGs like this. So if that wasn't obvious enough, this game gets a buy out of me, and that is pretty much where we're going to wrap up this particular video. So I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.